All right, hello everybody. I see we already have a few people in. We're just waiting for everybody to join in and then we'll start shortly. So Kevin, you got everything ready? You got your coffee and everything ready on your
I
side?
got my coffee set. Well, my iced tea,
Yeah,
being
that's
in the
how
South in the United States, I have my Southern iced tea setting in front of me,
true.
even
That
though it is the morning here. But yep, ready to go.
perfect.
You've got a coffee, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a must.
Well, hopefully it's not needed just because of my
Oh, absolutely.
webinar here. Hopefully people won't need the caffeine.
I always need like a coffee midday. So okay. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the final session to our Lexmark webinar series. I am Nina from Inspire and the moderator for this session today. And if in case you have missed last week's webinar, we will post the link to the on-demand videos in the chat box later on. However, you can also scan the QR code that you can see on the slide. And today we have Lexmark Enterprise Digital Twin Practice Lead, Kevin Playforth, who will show you how Lexmark uses Inspire, Designer and UPM-X to create a wide process architecture called Enterprise Digital Twin. So without further ado, Kevin, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Nina. So good day to everyone out there. Really appreciate your time and joining, and hopefully this session is great value to you, not only in terms of Inspired Designer UPM-X, but also in your process architecture journey that we have. So my name is Kevin Playforth, and I've been both sides of the fence as a technical developer inside IT and a business process consultant in many different Fortune 500 companies over the year. And this session is a scaled down version of a methodology that I've used in many years throughout my consulting practice, and we've brought it to Lexmark back home for me, as that's local to me, to deploy what we call Enterprise Digital Twin. And what we mean by Enterprise Digital Twin is we're creating a digital copy of what we do in practice. So how does the business do their jobs on a day-to-day basis, and what tools that we can use to create that in a digital environment to allow us to do what ifs and all kinds of fun stuff without messing up the real world. So when we look at what happens when you get into business architecture, there's always a challenge here. So when we face tools like Inspire that have great power, they have great flexibility, people tend to get overwhelmed, and we need to create something that's in a framework so can be used by multiple people, that we're not just creating silos of information, and all of that in a way that is scaled out so that we can actually get the job done, but without creating silos and artifacts that won't work together and can't piece together. If you've ever looked inside Designer, you can see, and let me flip over just real quick. And if we look at just a plain basic diagram, this is our canvas that we draw in. Over on the left-hand side, this is our shape library. So it is vast. If I open up UPM-X and expand this out, there are many different shapes at my disposal. These elements can be used for different purposes. Very easy to get overwhelmed, and that's just UPM-X. When I start talking about shapes and different text and swim lanes and containers, and we get into different symbols, we have BPMN capabilities are inside of there. You can see it can be very easy to create anything. It's a great power of the tool, but also can be a trouble when we're trying to create an architecture that works together. So how do we fix this? What do we do? Well, inside our philosophy for digital twin, what we have done is our goal is to simplify. We want to take this out to the business teams and make it usable for them. And so we've simplified. And the way you simplify and create a methodology is to create a foundation. And you do that with a building block. And so inside our digital twin methodology, our building block is the process activity. If you get nothing out of this webinar, know that the process activity is the keystone of our architecture on the process side. In the business, it represents, process activity is the bottom of the what and the top of the how. So when we talk about a process activity's function, it tells us what the business needs to do, but not necessarily how to do it. It gives us the structure and the stability to describe our entire organization in a consistent set of terms, which is key. I don't know, you guys have probably all been in meetings where you are talking about a subject and 30 minutes into the meeting, you realize that your assumption of what the meeting was about changed because you spent 30 minutes figuring out why you were there. A lot of this process architecture and using the process activity as the foundation is to avoid that. And we want to crisply define what we're doing. When we implement a process activity, it defines, using a set of role level tasks, how we complete that activity. We'll talk more about that in detail as we go through the next little bit of this webinar. But it is the subject of that. It compartmentalizes what those tasks are so that we have easily to relate that back to the architecture. Typically, a process activity is enabled by a single function. Now, I'm not talking department here. Most departments are named functionally, but I'm talking about those functional skill sets, those disciplines that exist. You should be able to tie process activity to a certain skill set. Maybe it's finance, logistics, sales, marketing, manufacturing, production planning. It should be easy to relate those activities to functions. Most of the time, when we implement a process activity, they're performed by multiple roles that exist inside organizations. And not always, because there are some that are less complex and simple that may be single roles. You can also think that process activities get performed by systems, and maybe they're completely automated activities. But this gives us a way to describe what the business is doing. Key piece of this, and if I have in the audience any IT practitioners out there, this might offend some of you, but a process activity is system agnostic. This is a very important piece in order to make our methodology of enterprise digital twin work on the process side, is because we need to create a stable architecture that doesn't change as system and technology changes. So being system agnostic in our process activity definition gives us the ability to switch out solutions underneath without affecting our architecture. And we can actually do organizational change management much easier because we have a consistent, stable process activity that now has a current state solution and a future state solution. Very important concept when we think about this. I always like to use the analogy here of when you look back in time before we had computers, we still did accounting. So the activities of accounting, for the most part, haven't changed. They're still the same. But the way we do accounting, the how, is changed. It used to be roomfuls of accountants with ledger books, and now we have tools like Oracle and SAP that do all the number crunching, and you have a different skill set of human interaction working inside those systems. But the what we need to do is still the same. When we think about standard work instructions and we have keystroke level, here's your desk procedures, here's how you work in certain transactions, process activities would be extrapolated up very far from that. It would not be, you could not define a process activity using a single work instruction, although most people try to, and those work instructions become novels, which is not something that we want. We want process activities to be higher level than that. We always, when we draw a process activity, depict it, name the process activity using a verb noun format that focuses on activities. I know I'll see a lot of people when they first start designing process diagrams, they will put paragraphs into the name of the activity, telling a story. We don't want that at this. It should be, what's my action? What am I acting on, in that format, to make a crisp activity. Graphically, when we draw activities, let me put my penknife on here. When we draw a process activity, we're defining what I like to call an IPO. So the input, the process itself, and then its output that we have. And this becomes a standard of defining a unique process activity is triggered by an event or a specific input and produces a specific output. So when you look at this drawing, the owning function, the input that drives it, the definition of the activity itself and its output, that is really the IPO, the defining description of that particular activity. And then once we have this, then we can start asking questions. Why do we perform this activity? So we need to understand the reasoning in filling out attributes of the activity. What is done in performing this activity? What's our input trigger that causes us to start? So on and so forth as we get through, defining that building block. So again, this is where we start. We've simplified all of that UPM-X power down to, on the process side, we're going to focus on that process activity element and use that as our foundation. Now, if I switch back over to ServiceNow, I have the ability to go in and look at my dictionary, if you will, of process activities. And so there's just the list alphabetically of process activities in there. So if I want to look at and search for preliminary invoicing comes up, then here's my activity that has been defined for preparing a preliminary invoice. So now we've talked about a graphical shape, but that's really a database object. If you remember from Ted's webinar that was previous to this, this all exists in the database, that UPM-X object. And then it gives us the ability to attribute and describe what that activity is. So I can start to look at, okay, what are all the tasks that it takes to complete that particular activity? Who's involved in completing that activity that exists there? Where is it located in the architecture itself? What diagrams is that particular activity shown in? So a lot of power that we get in the tool itself in helping to refine, process activities. Now, we think about that, that's not very useful in fixing our problem that we started out. That's the building block that we have. So how do we put those things together and organize them? So we talked about that dictionary view here in ServiceNow. That view, that report that is provided, gives us the list of all of them. But there are different ways to view activities. Now, the fact that that activity is whole and is structured and governed gives us the ability to use it in multiple different ways. So first, we might choose to use an architecture framework. Inside Lexmark, we are using APQC as our architecture framework. And let me flip back over real quick. And my Zoom bar is in the way. Inside our model, we've got APQC. There are many different ways you can create your own to do this, but using the power of Designer, this lets us drill down into our framework, and we are able to, from an enterprise architect point of view, govern and master all of our activities. Again, that we've used as a starting point APQC, but then also we've extended that, and there are places that we have Lexmark specific activities that we've added and enhanced and made this framework what we're doing at Lexmark. But again, so we had our dictionary list. Now the same activities can exist in our framework view And this is what we use to govern those activities. But then additionally, we may have a business capability view. So how do we organize our capabilities of the business? So often this is an executive management view. Executive management teams that gets together and say, this is the way we see our business. And we've often created these for different companies that in my consulting career, and all of the activities would have a home in each one of these sections there so that they could be related and reported on in a way that speaks the language of the executive community. And then most often what we choose to do is create value streams for these process activities. And so we get into how do we tell the story of what the business is doing? And that's really what I want to focus on as we go through here is how do we tell the business story? How do we get this done? So if you will, and I don't mean to make this overly simplistic, but again, that's, me being from the South, I like to do that to where everybody understands. If you take a process activity and you think of, we're trying to communicate that business story, and you think about our verbal communication, words are the equivalent of a process activity. That's the foundation, that's the building block of our communication that we have. So now, how do we go up that tree and put things together? So you put words together in sentences, and you have different functionality and things that go together to make a sentence, and you can start communicating. That's kind of like our sub-processes. We aggregate activities into sub-processes. Just like sentences are put together to make paragraphs, we put together sub-processes, and those build processes. And then at the top, you can have all of these paragraphs that put together to start making up stories. And that's kind of like our value streams. And so that gets into things like market to cash and order to procure to pay and things like that. So let's take a look at some of that and what it looks like inside Designer and what we're building. Okay, here is a diagram, and this is meant to be an eye chart right now. I like to think of this as my Google Maps capability. So what we'll do in that upper level of telling our business story is we will put whatever our topic is, and this gives us great flexibility in telling different business stories. This is our financial planning and analysis end to end, our value stream for financial planning and analysis. And so at this level, you're really looking at that state level view to where we've got demand planning for hardware and supplies. We've got our hardware revenue and margin planning, all of these different major process sections that are on here that gives me what do I want to see next. And so using our Zoom capability of Designer and the flexibility of the canvas, I can then zoom in and I start to uncover, okay, here are my activities. Now, these are the same activities that exist in that dictionary list view that's in that ServiceNow report. It's the same set of activities that we tie into the framework in our APQC model so that we can govern them. And it gives us the ability to tell, in this case, the story of demand planning for hardware that exists under our financial planning and analysis that is there. And so each one of these activities are linked together using its inputs and outputs to tell a particular story that we have. We are currently also working actively in really flushing out our revenue accounting stream. And same thing here. If I look at my asset management, I have three different activities that find in the context of doing our managed services revenue accounting. These three activities are what the team has defined in order to complete that section of the process. And when we see that there are places that we do not have those answers yet, what we do is create placeholders so that we know what to schedule, we know what the gaps are, and we can hook things up later. And because we have those dictionary objects, we can create them and relate them as we see fit. If I slide over to the right, you can see this is previous work that we were done based on invoicing, which is a trigger to some of that revenue accounting, that we were able to create bridges that link those together. So these were created probably 9 to 10 months ago. Based on this work that's currently underway, we were able to link those in and link those puzzle pieces together, which Designer allows us to do very nicely. So that gives us that top level view of what we're doing as a business. So nobody could take any of those diagrams and start to do work inside Lexmark, but you can have a lot of conversations about where do we need to improve, contextualize meetings if we use those terms as equity there, and it really facilitates. You see some of the value of using that digital twin and the methodology that we have there. So let's talk about the details now. So how do we go underneath an activity? Remember, I was saying that activities are the bottom of the what. This is defining what we do as a business. And it's the top of the how, which begins into the details of that. So when I implement an activity, I get into task. And so I'm going to use that task object. Think of that as when we have words, they're made up of letters. You can't have a word without drawing letters. And so that would be kind of the tasks that make up an activity in order to create that activity. And then underneath that, we're going to get into standard work instructions. So every letter has a certain stroke pattern. It has a way that it looks. You have a certain instruction of how do I make that letter. Think of that as standard work instructions. And standard work instructions for us is a kind of a job aid procedure. It is a keystroke level. How do you do a certain transaction? What fields do you populate? What are the correct values to go in those fields? And so if you look at this entire architecture, we've gone from very high level concepts, market to cash, procure to pay, all the way down into keystroke level events that happen in certain transactions on certain fields. And it's very organized and is maintainable. And the key thing is scalable, because you can't boil the ocean, with a hairdryer. You have to be able to compartmentalize. And by creating and using that activity as a way, we can tell different stories in the top, because there may be, we're focused on revenue accounting, and that's a part of a larger value stream, market to cash. And because we have these governed activities, it gives us the ability to create these different stories that we need to tell at the top, but uses the same how, because we have no variation or I will say we have purposeful variation in the way that we document how we do work. And let's talk about that in the next segment here of what this looks like as we go into the how. So we already talked about our process activity. Again, what work do we need to do as a company? That is our keystone. If you take nothing else out, started a process activity and grow. We have our IPO of that process activity graphically. So when we implement a process activity, we use a process workflow inside Designer. So that process workflow element is directly related and is the implementation that begins the how journey of a process activity. Inside of a process workflow, we start sequencing tasks in order that need to be done in the scope of this activity. So now, if I have a crisply defined activity, it makes this work much easier, because I know what my trigger is and I know where to stop. I know what I have to produce in order to complete this workflow. And the other piece of this that's important is we assign responsibilities. Now, I hope everybody's going, oh, yeah, that's a swim lane diagram. Again, it's very simple. It should be simple to understand, very doable, very attainable. So what we have here is we have 4 concepts from UPM-X. We have our process activities at the top that's defining our context, defining our subject. We have our workflow, which defines our boundaries and our pool, if you will, of our process task and the actors that are responsible for performing those tasks. So now let's jump over to InSpy and see that and how it works. So if I go here to my diagram that we created that we used at the very first. And Ted had mentioned this. One of the things that we do, pardon me, is to drive consistency is to use templates. And so starting with a diagram, we have a template that represents a process workflow. So what we've done is created a shape library that is for us, that allows us to drive consistency from model to model. And this swim lane pool, if I click on the header of it, you'll notice that we have this shape tied to our process workflow table. And so that when we define this pool, it creates an element that exists as a process workflow. Our lanes that exist coming out of the template are defaultly tied to our actor tables. So as we use these swim lanes, this allows us to be very consistent, because I can come in here to the element and say, well, I need my asset management specialist is going to be the actor in that swim lane. So I'm able to pull that out of the dictionary and immediately start using that actor here. And then we use, as building those diagrams, our process task element to start sequencing those together. And that's the way that we start building these models. So if you look at the way we tie these together, I'll flip up over to our revenue accounting flow when we talk about our asset management. In these activities, what that allows us to do is create a process workflow that is tied to this activity, and that diagram I can link to and then be able to drop into the how. And this workflow defines how we manage customer asset data and the different roles that are involved. And it could be systems. If I jump into a work that we've done in customer invoicing, and we look at that activity that we pulled up in the dictionary, how do we prepare a preliminary invoice? Then you can see is we also have our systems that are performing automated tasks inside of here, right alongside of our human-based tasks that we need to complete these. And these workflows can be as complex as what we need. Another item that I'll mention here is we're using attributing of those tasks to extend the functionality that's in Designer and give us things that we need. So if I look at, we've created an extension that allows us to do automation level. So looking at what are completely manual tasks, what are supported by systems, where do we use RPA, and what is fully system automated that are inside there. And then we've been able to leverage the functionality of real-time indicators that allow us to create, in this case, symbols. And you can see here the legend that shows at a glance, when I look at this, okay, most of this is manual. In fact, maybe all of it is, in this particular case, all manual, supported by a system in the back end. And then we've able to use a field that we've called transactions inside that task, where we can put the tool or the technology SAP T code that is supporting that particular transaction. And then again, using a real-time indicator in Designer, show that label underneath the tool. And it becomes a very usable piece, not only for IT, but also operationally for the business team that's inside of there. Another very good concept, if I can get back to the proper page here, we talk about variation that might exist with us inside there. And on this top level diagram, you can see my process activity I've used as a container that shows multiple process workflows. And so what we're doing in this is we're using a process activity. That's what we need to do. But how we need to do it varies depending on the situation of the business. So in this case, this is a resolution flow. This activity is about resolving errors that come out in the revenue accounting space. And we've captured 10 different categories of different processes that exist to handle that. So this allows us to very quickly and easily still speak the same language, but purposely create different variation in the way that we solve that problem in particular. So it becomes using that structure of activity to workflow to task. You can see in just using these three, it's very powerful in the way that we put that together. Keeping it simple doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of power and we can't leverage what is existing there in Designer for us. So, and let's continue our journey down inside of this. The next page, we talked about our standard work instructions. We know that tasks get into how do we complete an activity, what our individual responsibilities are. Underneath each of those tasks, we have our standard work instructions that exist. And those are tied to, compartmentalized with the task that is the subject of that standard work instruction. Oftentimes what I see in companies is standard work instructions on their own, you never know exactly where to start and where to end, and they become books. I've seen standard work instruction documents that were 500 pages. And so if I'm a user and I need to know how to find out to do a particular transaction or a step, it's a search for me. And so it's often they create their own out of that, which creates non-standard processes. So what we like to do is create those standard work instructions underneath the context of a task. And then that task gives us the ability to very precisely find what we need to do when we need to do it. So let's take that through. What can we do in Designer there? How about creating a page that is the launch page for a role? So in this case, here's my invoicing specialist, and we're able to create a view that uses our process workflow, process activities. So this is our dimensioned process activities that represent our swim lanes here. And then inside of those are the activities that exist for this role inside that particular context. So for preparing preliminary invoices in our FICA application, these are the responsibilities for that invoicing specialist. Now, for that invoicing specialist, there's no sequence here. It's just, here's what I need to do. The goal is that the invoicing specialist says, oh, I need help in approving my preliminary invoice in SAP. Here becomes our standard work instruction link for that particular step in the process, that particular task. And by the way, we can see that in this case, there are 3 different ways to accomplish that work. So again, another piece of the way we handle variation. So a user can very quickly go here and say, oh, I need to know how to do the mass approval using this transaction. Click that and launch. And again, we've jumped out of Designer itself, and we are currently using PDFs to create these step level instructions and how we need to do that. But you can see how we can create launch pages for different roles very quickly and easily that get them to what they need to see. And we haven't sacrificed our architecture at all. It is still in the same way. All of this still has context that exists in our, when we look at our end-to-end flows, and we're able to drill down into how we need to do a particular version of work, getting us into what the task definitions are that exist for those particular things and defining those. You know, here's our task, all of the relationships that exist in those tasks and where they're located in diagrams. Really powerful technology, gives you an ability to standardize and make consistent throughout the community in a version of process that is truly used by the business and leveraged by IT. And I think that kind of brings us back full circle. So the summary of what we have is process activity is at the center of our foundation. It is the bottom of what we do. Support, aggregated into sub-processes, processes, and value streams in a very flexible storytelling methodology at the top, depending on what we need to talk about, having that governed activity. And then it is the top of the how. It creates that foundation that allows us to create structure and stability around how we do work, using the same tasks, not letting people organically grow. We can build these process workflows using tasks and roles that get us to the standard work instructions, which gets us to the detail of how we do individual keystrokes in certain contexts of tasks. So that brings me to the end of what we've presented here. So hopefully this has been enjoyable for you and you've gotten something out of it. It's been great for me to be able to present it to you.
So thank you for this insightful and fantastic presentation, Kevin. Let's move on to the Q&A part of the session. I see we do have a few questions in. So here goes the first one. What's the value of having a digital twin?
This is a really good question. And those that, if there's any Lexmarkers on here, they know me, I could talk for several days on this, but really like to focus on the value of this being in to create a single version of the truth. We use the digital twin to represent, operationally what the business is doing on a day-to-day basis, creating a version that they are able to use and then can be leveraged by other communities. So there may be upstream, downstream partners that exist that don't understand the seams between different business functions. So this gives us an ability to very crisply define those. Big value in most of the time in most businesses, upstream, downstream customers don't have ability to go back and look at the processes, and all of this is in the same database. It's not stored in SharePoint files or in individuals' computers, so everybody has visibility there. Gives the ability for IT to truly understand what the business is doing. Often what you see in IT deployments is, they document processes that exist to the system, how the business is going to use the system. Well, that leaves out what I call spreadsheet or ERP, all of the spreadsheets that the business creates to plug the gaps between IT. And that is never part of the enterprise architecture. We've actually in enterprise formalized those. If the business team has a spreadsheet that becomes part of their methodology, it becomes an application service. So we're able to track these Excel templates, and it gives us an opportunity for improvement. So how do we put that into an automation now? Tremendous value in creating a asset that is both usable from a operational, but also controllable from an architectural governance. And then we can use that in projects to continuously improve.
All right, great. Moving on to the next question. What's the effort to build the digital twin, and what does the team looks like?
That's another good question. So it takes a village. We'll say it that way. The effort, it's like, I think Carol said this in the first session, it is a marathon, not a sprint. When you look at doing these, you're going to need process analysts, you're going to need people in Designer that can design, but you're also going to need subject matter experts. You're going to need enterprise architects. You're going to need business process owners that can do approvals. It takes a village. I use a planning unit of about 8 hours per process workflow. So if we think about one of those diagrams that I was showing, it's about 8 hours of effort. And what our goal is you can't do that with just a small localized team. We want to scale and put Designer capability in the hands of all Lexmarkers, and especially that key user community. We want everybody to be comfortable in Designer as far as a consumption point of view, but then we're trying to scale out and create that team that can work in a consistent way, that know how to be practitioners in Designer. And we're focused on the business community because they have the expertise in their processes. And then we have a training curriculum that we're putting forward to give them the tools to be successful in that, and also be consistent team to team, so we don't have that variation that exists there. And so, and that process is underway. We're still growing and maturing in that. And enterprise digital twin is a living, breathing thing. Just like you never finish working on applications and system deployment, we treat our process architecture the same way. Our enterprise digital twin on the process side, it is as important to implement a process as any system that we implement. And we want to continually care and feed and have ownership so that none of the data gets stale. It's always used as the discovery phase for any process improvement.
All right, so that was all the question for today. Thank you for answering all of it, Kevin. And also thank you for everyone for attending the session today. And if you were here throughout the whole series, thank you once again. To our fantastic speakers, Carol, Mark, Ted, and Kevin, it was a real pleasure hearing about Lexmark's holistic approach to digital transformation. And if you want, you can visit our website, book a demo, and find the full webinar series landing page. You can just scan the QR code that you can see on this slide, and you will have it all there. And on this, I wish you all to have a very nice day and week. Goodbye.